Now, I do want to first warn you that there will be spoilers for the two newest episodes of Star Wars Rebels, those being Jedi Night and Dume. So if you haven't seen them yet, do yourself a favor and check them out first before watching this video. And with that said, let me start out by talking about the big moment in the first of these two episodes. And it was a moment I think a lot of us knew was coming eventually, that being the death of Kanan Jarrus. And I say it's a moment that we knew was coming simply because there was almost no way he was going to survive through the end of the series, and thus pretty much contradict the idea that Luke is the last hope or last Jedi during the time of the original trilogy. What will this now mean for Ezra with Kanan gone in these last few episodes? Well, we've had it teased in the trailer that he will in some respect encounter Emperor Palpatine, so though I think it's unlikely, he could also be killed or even fall to the dark side. Honestly though, I think the death of Kanan will be what eventually steers him away from the path of the Jedi, and when the series ends in a few episodes, he will go off and do his own thing. I think the reason Kanan was killed off now was to begin to show Ezra going down a new and different path in these final episodes, one without his master there to guide him, and I think there's really a good chance that whatever animated show comes next will include Ezra in it, and most likely Sabine as well. As I've said before, these two characters in particular have been built up the most during Rebels, and I have a very hard time believing we won't be seeing them again and seeing them again soon. Anyway, going back to the death of Kanan and this episode called Jedi Night, I think my biggest gripe with it was how telegraphed Kanan's death was. I mean, going in, I was actually pretty oblivious to the fact that he might die in this very episode, thinking this was something they'd reserved for the series finale. So when Kanan kept acting strange and like he himself knew he was going on his last adventure, I was actually caught off guard by this and kept saying to myself, nah, they're not really going to kill him here. And I actually started to think they were teasing it so much that it wasn't going to happen. But then when Hera told him that she loved him and they kissed, I felt like his fate was 100% sealed at that point, and sure enough, it was. And him sacrificing himself to save his friends was probably the only way to really end this great character without a huge backlash from fans, because I personally feel like he's been the best character in the show overall, and he deserved a hero's death. And what he got was just that. And in hindsight, him seeming to know he was going to die on this adventure, and probably foreseeing dying saving his friends, makes this episode even better, because he was so calm and accepting of his impending death, one that he knew would be the price to save his friends, and Hera in particular. In other words, he was a true, selfless Jedi, and yet so much more because he cared a great deal for his friends and family, or what he thought of as his family, not unlike another Jedi I used to know. And if you followed his story from his comic book run that showed what became of him after Order 66, through the book A New Dawn, which showed how he met Hera and what he was like in that point in his life, which was not very Jedi-like, and then now watched him grow back into a full-fledged Jedi through these 4 seasons of Rebels, thanks in large part to teaching Ezra, I'd say, I think you, or at least I am, can be very satisfied with the way his story ended. Again, keeping in mind pretty much it always had to end where it did, right before the original trilogy is set to kick off. Now, as for his eyesight returning in the last moments of his life so that he could see Hera one last time, that was a nice touch, and I can only guess he was so in tune with the Force in those last few seconds that he was able to use it to heal himself, even if he wasn't aware he was doing it. It's one of those things that I don't want to think too much about because it really was a perfect way to end this episode, which, in many respects, showcased what could have been between Hera and Kanan had there been no war for her to fight and for him to be dragged into. As for the rest of this first episode, I again love how this show is tying into the bigger picture. I love hearing Tarkin mention Director Krennic's Stardust program, and just being able to sense the animosity between Tarkin and Krennic, which was seen in Rogue One and was further expanded upon in the novel Catalyst. They've made the show feel like a prelude to Rogue One and the original trilogy, but done it in a way that doesn't sacrifice the integrity of the show itself just to make it feel like a prelude. I again go back to the character of Kanan, who, like pretty much all the other main characters throughout the course of this show, was a brand new one, yet now feels like as much of a part of Star Wars as any other character the movies have introduced, at least from my point of view. And much like with Clone Wars, this show is Star Wars and feels like it takes place in the same universe as the movies, and in many ways has actually helped the movies out in many respects, especially Clone Wars, which, of course, took place between episodes 2 and 3, and gave so much more depth to the story of the prequels that I actually appreciate the prequels and the story they told far more now than I did before the series. Okay, now moving on to the second episode, called Dume. This one showcased what I have both liked and at times disliked about this fourth and final season of Rebels. It was really just a transition episode that showed us the response of the Ghost crew to Kanan's death, and continued to set up whatever is going on with Ezra, these wolves, and seemingly the planet Lothal somehow, as well as with Mortis, I'm assuming. The problem with it, though, is there was no real self-contained story in this episode itself, which has been something a couple other episodes this season has suffered from. Now, I'm not exactly upset or complaining about it, because overall, I do like this season and how it has felt more like one long story instead of just short, self-contained stories that loosely tie into each other, kind of like the last 3 seasons have been. In fact, a great many episodes in those previous 3 seasons have suffered greatly from just being too short or feeling like complete filler. And in a perfect world, I think, shorter seasons of hour-long episodes instead of half-hour episodes would have been the way to go for this show. Nevertheless, I'm not saying this episode just felt like complete filler, rather it felt kind of like an epilogue to the previous episode, like, here's the repercussions to what just happened. Again, it's not so much a complaint because I do think we needed a bit of a pause so that the characters could reflect on the loss of Kanan, but I think these 2 episodes would have been better served had they just been combined into one long hour-long episode, and more time would have been spent on the build-up to Kanan's death and less on what everyone did after. Because essentially 3 things happened in the second episode, and all of them could have been placed perhaps in the last 10 minutes or so of a long episode. The first thing that happened was Sabine and Zeb, out of anger, wanted to lash out against the Empire, and I like that Thrawn was shown anticipating this. But instead of attacking a planned parade by the Empire, they have an encounter with Rook, and I did like that Zeb would have pummeled Rook to death had Sabine not interfered, but at the same time it doesn't make much sense that she stopped him, considering how earlier in the episode they were seen having zero regard for the lives of stormtroopers, and they, or should I say she, rigged a bomb to blow some up, not to mention how many other Imperials these 2 have killed along the way. And I always find it a bit odd, and even a little jarring, how in movies and shows sometimes characters will suddenly take a moral stance about killing someone, even though they've been shown killing a great many others before, and usually with reckless abandon. To me, this whole encounter just comes off feeling as a time killer for the episode, which goes back to this not needing to be a full episode in the first place. Another thing that was shown in this episode was Hera mourning Kanan and adding a piece to her family's Calicory to represent him, and of course Chopper being there to comfort her, which might have been my favorite aspect of this episode, to see a different side of our favorite grumpy droid. And even though there may not have been much of an actual story here, I did still like and appreciate the fact that this episode showed how each of these characters responded to the loss of Kanan, and how different those responses were. It's actually a shame there's only a handful of episodes left, because I think a lot could now be done with these characters with Kanan out of the picture. In other words, there's a potential for some great stories to come out of who these characters will become in the absence of their inspirational Jedi leader. And I do hope we see these stories told somewhere. Again, we almost certainly will with Ezra and Sabine, but what comes next for Hera and Chopper, and even Zeb assuming he survives, are stories I really do hope get told somewhere. And the last thing this episode showed was Ezra feeling lost without Kanan and fleeing from these loath wolves we've been seeing all season. He also encounters a larger than normal one, which I can only assume was their master, who then told Ezra there was danger, and that there was important secrets in the Jedi Temple on Lothal that needed to be protected. He also presented him with part of a tablet which will apparently have something to do with Mortis. As far as what that is, well, I might make a video speculating on that in the near future. And let me now say that even though Ezra has not exactly been my favorite character, I am very curious to see what they're doing with him and how this show is going to end for him. Again, I think there's no chance that this is the end of his story, but rather just the beginning. And whatever is going on with him is going to set up the next chapter of his life and story, and even likely the next animated series. Because I do wonder if whatever Ezra is about to learn, along with the loss of Kanan, will be what turns him from the Jedi path and sends him down a completely different one that is maybe anti-Jedi, but not necessarily dark side. And I personally think it would be interesting if Ezra becomes a bit of a foil for Luke Skywalker in the time period between episodes 6 and 7, and that's where the new animated show, that I'm assuming they're going to make, will take place. I mean, when you think about it, Luke will almost certainly hear about Kanan and Ezra during his time with the Rebellion. Keep in mind that Leia even met the two, and that we know Hera, thanks to her appearance in Forces of Destiny, where she talks with Han post Return of the Jedi, will survive and could also tell Luke about the two, and maybe even tell him what became of Ezra. So I don't think it's impossible that Luke, looking to restart the Jedi Order after the events of Return of the Jedi, may try and seek out Ezra either to recruit him or just to learn what he can from him. And maybe when the two meet, Ezra, who again might be anti-Jedi, will begin to plant the seeds of doubt in Luke's mind about the Jedi and help him begin to see the Force in a different way, which of course, maybe, just maybe, begins to explain what he has become in The Last Jedi. Now, do I actually think that's going to happen? No, it's unlikely, but it's something that I think would be interesting to explore. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you thought of these 2 episodes of Rebels, and what you think the future of Ezra might look like. So leave a comment below, and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.